Chapter 10. Carrie put the bowls on the table, and they got as comfortable as they could on the hard wooden benches. I have to review a file. She pulled out the manila envelope that had arrived earlier. I hope you don't mind. You have to do what you have to do, Will said. I'll check out your interesting library. He nodded toward the ragtag and water-damaged heap of books on the shelf. She smiled and bent her head over the proposed itinerary and accommodations plan for Diva's next tour. As she ate, she tried to concentrate on the logistical concerns and security problems the proposal outlined. Her own concerns and problems kept intruding, starting with the man sitting across from her, thumbing through her tattered old copy of Bowditch. A year had passed since she last shed a tear over Alex, and she sure wasn't going to shed any now. That part of her life was over. She was single, would stay single, and would never get herself so wrapped up in any guy again. She wasn't up for a life of serial monogamy, falling in and out of love, getting married and divorced. She'd return to her pre-Alex lifestyle, dating now and then, hanging out more often, partying hard when the opportunity arose. Not that her job allowed for much of that. Diva could party, the entourage could party, the fans could party, but she could never let her guard down for a moment, especially when everyone else was partying. Between tours, she'd allowed short stints when she'd seen only one guy for a while, but when that happened, she had made sure everyone knew she was not committing again. This made her an anomaly among mid-30s women. Most wanted to settle down with Mr. Right, and one man had applied a little pressure, trying to get her to find a job that didn't require so much traveling. Stay put for a while, he'd said. He'd started in on that campaign after she'd let slip that working for the high-maintenance star was beginning to wear on her. It was true, she couldn't do the job forever. The stress level was just too high. If she let her guard down for a moment, either the fans or the star herself always made a lot of trouble. Then there was the fact that she didn't love the music scene. Music, yes, but the glitz, glamour, competition, constant one-upsmanship, media hype, and fawning admirers really got under her skin. Plus, she found Diva's joy in fame silly, and her insistence that she could safely go out in the world like any normal person asinine. No, she didn't love her job. Her loves were her boat and sailing. Once she had a big enough nest egg stashed away, she would leave Diva and switch to something in the marine industry. She wasn't sure what yet. There was always security for boat shows. She gave a guffaw. And that's why she was unable to forgive and forget what Alex had done to the boat. Ever After had represented her escape, her weekends off, her vacations, her home base, much more than her condo in Old Greenwich. Further, the little boat represented her eventual freedom. She might have been able to put aside the desire to kick her ex in the teeth for stealing it if she'd found it in good condition. Now, she also wanted to break his nose in his arms for trashing it. But that was a moot point. If she ever got the chance to kick Alex's ass, she'd damn well take it. But right here, in her salon, was a guy with whom she was finding she could have a good time. It was perfect that they were both in town temporarily. She could be interested or not interested. Treat him like a prince or like dirt, or like a summer romance. It wouldn't matter in the long run. And then she'd go back to her life, and he'd go back to his. Perfect. Except it was insane to get involved right now. There were already too many guys tangling up her life. Her bad ex-husband, from the look of what had gone on tonight, was not gone. Someone, she wondered who, might have a grudge against someone connected to him, and by extension to her. Or at least that's what Will claimed. She had only his word, what these goons had said, or that they'd said anything at all. Then there was Larry, who she had gone out with a few times. He'd been hinting at wanting something more. And Seth, who she'd been with last night, had been way too clingy. She sighed and turned another page to continue the pretense of reading. She needed to get the boat finished and get out of here. The cushions would determine how long she'd need to stick around. She'd have all the mechanical jobs done in 3 or 4 days, and then get ready to leave. But no denying it. Up the mast, down the mast, creeping around in the dark, sending her boat spinning on the river's current, and now sitting here looking quite sexy and gorgeous in his disheveled, sweaty way. Will had a bad habit of making her heart race, and she'd been missing that. The trouble was, if she got close to him, he'd instantly be in her way. Not only because she had to get the job done and get back home, but also because, until the big one came along, she wanted to be free. Men were for casual sex, not partnership. So she would use the grubby little liar, as needed for grunt labor, take whatever benefits came along, and leave it at that. As he shoveled ramen into his mouth, it was really good, or he was really hungry, Will watched Carrie read and wondered about her. Could she be as nonchalant about all this as she appeared? Her ability to remain in control in harrowing circumstances was amazing. She'd led them on a successful escape from thugs, and now here they were, getting along like old buddies, drinking beer, eating dinner, telling stories. Well, she'd told hers. He, by contrast, felt jumpy as a rabbit on roller skates. Not only was he still listening for angry voices, but he was also replaying his steering mistake, as if by imagining it differently, he could produce a different outcome. The knowledge that he'd have wrecked the boat if it weren't for Carrie left him annoyed with himself and vowing to learn to handle watercraft. He'd spent a lot of time in and around them, but couldn't make them do anything but go straight ahead at speed. Then there was the secrecy. When asked about his background, he'd had to change the subject. He didn't want anyone to know what he was doing. He'd leave it where it was. He was running from a broken heart. Telling her he was a marine biologist would stir up questions. If nothing else, he wanted to avoid the withering look that would cross her face about how someone in a water-based career could be so bad with boats. He could follow her lead when she next asked about his background. She'd mentioned where she grew up and what she did in her spare time, but left out her real identity and her occupation. In the midst of laying bare her marital debacle, she'd been cagey about the rest of her life. He understood that desire and would follow suit. The last thing he wanted right now was an inquisitive woman checking on his activities. Not that trying to establish a baseline was in any way nefarious. Taking water samples and photographs was not illegal. Even the nighttime raids with Jeff, going on to Tull's property to take the soil samples and install the cameras, weren't going to get him arrested. Tull hadn't posted no trespassing signs yet. If he caught them there and told them not to come on his property, of course that would be different. There was nothing wrong with asking questions either. But getting on the wrong side of public opinion would accomplish exactly the opposite of his aim. If it came out now that he was skulking around trying to get the goods on a small business owner, scum or not, and suspecting a well-loved civic leader of sociopathic behavior, his project would come to an abrupt end. He'd become another one of those scientists that conservatives like to sling mud at. They'd make him look like he was out to prove his beliefs rather than the truth. But he had to do something, and maybe when the whole thing came to trial, he'd be lucky enough to get a judge who would listen. But he had new information now, gleaned from eavesdropping on a gang of inept thugs. Someone wanted them to scuttle a boat. They'd actually set foot on Carrie's boat after she'd told them not to. Now that was illegal. And given where he'd just seen them, working on Reuben's Jellyball site, the connection was there to be made. But without proof, he couldn't make that connection for anyone but himself. His adversaries had some power and were allied with the fishing industry. Reuben Tull, Dick Polk, Jim Hammer, these were men who knew people. If they got wind of what he was doing, they might file industrial espionage charges, which, even if they didn't stick, would damage his professional credibility. His local clients, Jeff and Lily Galavi, would come under attack, even more than they were already. They'd already been speaking against the plant, even though their friends and family were all for it. Lily had been calling officials, holding meetings, and writing letters for months. She'd joined Bounce the Jelly Balls, an organization of concerned citizens who didn't want a smelly processing plant near their homes. No, he could not trust Carrie with his secret, but he could fish around a little and see where her sympathies lay. When she finally put the file aside a few minutes later and got up to wash the dishes, he decided to run a test. "Have you heard about the big fight?" "Fight?" Carrie shook her head. "Now that you've been in town a couple of days, I thought you might. I suppose where you come from, it would qualify as more of a squabble going on between some local groups. But around here, it's like there's a war on." "Oh," she let out a one-note laugh. "I thought you meant like a boxing match or something, or that shooting last night." "What groups?" "Shooting?" "Some farmers, along with the Gullah community, and some recent arrivals who want to protect the traditional way of life, have joined forces to keep the old boys and commercial fishermen from ruining their community. The newcomers, many of whom were actually good old boys back home, are up in arms against the profit at any cost business model and the good old boys network upon which it runs." She looked sideways at him. "Which side are you on? You look like one group and speak like the other." "Speak like?" He ran back over what he'd said. "Upon which it runs." A pompous turn of phrase. His face got hot. He had let his persona slip. It must have abandoned him while he was caught up in handling the crisis of the current. He cleared his throat. "Well, I do like to talk so's I fit in, ma'am." He grinned, until he noticed that she had one eyebrow raised. Uh-oh. "What did you study in college, back when you were eating all that instant brain food?" He glanced around, looking for an escape. "Oh, some of this, some of that." The eyebrow was still quite high up her forehead. "General studies." She pursed her lips. "Social science." "Damn! I was hoping you'd done a Voc-Tech course in diesel mechanics." The sarcasm in her voice was buttery enough to clog his arteries, but Will acted like he didn't hear it and shook his head. "Sorry, you're on your own there. I can fill a gas tank, change a tire, and pull the starter cord on my outboard. If nothing happens when I pull it, it goes to the shop." At the look on her face, he could see he'd revealed too much. She seemed to have a knack for getting information out of him. Now her wheels were turning again as she puzzled out whether he meant the outboard on the houseboat, which he'd already told her wasn't his, or if he owned an outboard somewhere else. Damn, he wasn't as good as he thought at this cloak and dagger stuff. He'd had 2 months' practice, but after only a day, she was already working her way under the surface. He changed the subject. "Look, we should get all this cleaned up." Everything was still all over the place. Carrie, shocked into action when he'd jumped aboard, had left more than the oil change gear out. Engine parts lay here and there. He could still see a sheen of oil across the striped floorboards. To make room for them to eat, she'd shoved the bags and boxes that littered the table to one end and kicked aside an assortment of items that had fallen to the floor. "I'm not too useless with soap and water. If you've got a rag, I'll help you get the cabin straightened up, and then we can go outside and enjoy this beautiful night." Carrie nodded, turned, and dug a bottle of spray cleaner and a rag out from under the sink and thrust them into his hands. Then she began scooping up packages of things and stuffing them into lockers or back into bags. "I hope nothing broke." She stood holding the bags and surveying the mess. "Generally, I keep everything very shipshape. I promise next time you come to visit, I'll have Ever After looking much more swanky than she does now." Will smiled as he squatted and began to swab the floor. It was actually refreshing to see her looking a little shell-shocked over something as inconsequential as a clutter of tools and rusty parts. At least now he knew she wasn't a ninja robot, which was what he'd begun to suspect. The cleanup done, they stood together, an awkward moment stretching between them. The thoughts in Will's head battled for supremacy. She was hot, whip-smart, and noticed every nuance. Had she already seen through his disguise? Look at those lips. She'd questioned his speech patterns, and now she was talking about making her boat look nice next time he came over. Why would she care what a guy who looked like he looked thought about how her boat looked? He'd put off her questions. Then she'd acknowledged that there might be cause for them to spend more social time together. Will welcomed that idea on a theoretical level. She was, after all, extremely attractive and highly interesting. No denying he wanted to get everything he could out of her, starting with more information about those thugs and what connection they had to her ex-husband, and ending with, well, there were those lips. Hang on, Rico Suave. He dragged his gaze from her mouth. He couldn't afford to set up a situation where she'd watch his movements or look for a chance to invite him aboard again. He'd be sure to do something to heighten her curiosity, like heading out into the night dressed all in black and carrying a black backpack as he had last night for his job with Jeff. Starting something with her would be so inconvenient. Not only would she be in his way, with all her questions, but judging from this evening's events, she might already be in danger. And the same people he was watching appeared to be watching her. He thrust the dirty rag and the bottle out to her, sticking a fake smile on his face. Much better to keep her at arm's length. Carrie set down the binoculars, lay back against the cabin again, and stared into the black. There was still no sign of any activity on the river or along the bank. Though she was very tired, her senses were alert for any threat. She'd tried to keep the conversation going, and Will had tried for a while too. But once they'd cleaned up, eaten, and told their stories, there was little to talk about, other than their near escape, and they'd kicked that horse to death. The natural topics for new acquaintances, job, family, plans for the future, they both skirted with as little detail as possible. Coming up with other topics in order to avoid the elephant in the room, which was, of course, sleeping arrangements, became more and more awkward until finally they'd fallen silent. If she thought there was any chance the thugs would come out here and get them, she'd have solved the sleeping together problem by setting a watch schedule. But that was unnecessary, and she knew Will knew it. To suggest such a thing would further heighten the tension. When she found herself stifling her 7th or 8th yawn, Carrie shook herself, stretched, and looked up at the stars. Out here in the river, away from the lights of the marina, and with nothing but marsh around them, the darkness was deep, warm, and velvety. The stars looked like sugar and diamonds. She stood up and, out of habit, scanned the water around them. Will stretched out along the settee, seemed asleep, his head cradled by the coils of lines and halyards that usually hung from hooks against the cabin. With his tangled hair and scruffy beard, and with his sleek, muscled forearms folded across his chest, he could be posing for a statue of Neptune resting after tossing frightened sailors about on frothy waves. Except for the jeans, they'd have to go. She cleared her throat. He opened his eyes. You're welcome to continue sleeping right there if you're comfortable. He shifted. Actually, it's a little hard. He sat up. I'm going to see about making a bed for us. A sleepy, sly look crinkled the corners of his eyes. She looked away. It's going to be Spartan. I bought one air mattress, which I'm going to try to fit in the V-berth. It will bend up at the foot and may not work at all. There's one pillow and one blanket. The only other soft item on the whole boat is the bag of rags from the hardware store. It might function as a rudimentary pillow. We should be comfortable enough, but it's getting a little chilly. We'll have to snuggle up. He nodded. I think I can put up with that. Now that we've been in battle together, we're like soldiers in the trenches. We work with what we have, and we are not ashamed to share body heat. Am I right? Far as I can tell, ma'am, you are always right. He grinned and sat up. Though it was more of a retreat than a battle, he ran his hand through his hair. And we're more like fugitive pirates than soldiers. Whatever we are, we're going to sleep rough and get along without toiletries. No toothpaste, no soap, other than bilge cleaner, and that all-purpose stuff you used on the floor. Pirate, he said, pointing at himself with ironic hands. It was a perfect imitation of Johnny Depp as Captain Jack Sparrow, and Carrie cracked up. Also, do I look like I care about personal grooming? He turned his head one way, then the other, and gave his hair a toss. No, not at the moment. She would lay a bet, though, that like the actor he was aping, in whatever his real life was, Will Masterson cared very much about how he looked. Half an hour later, after wrestling the vinyl airbed into place in the V-berth and struggling to keep the pump in the hole, Carrie finally created something that resembled a bed. I know it looks lame and saggy, she told Will, who'd come forward to see what all the cursing was about. If I fill it any more, the foot end won't fit. But once we're both on it, our weight will distribute the air better and we'll have a little bit of a cushion. If not, she shrugged, we sleep on hard bunks. And with that, she stripped down to tank top and panties, clambered up into the bunk, and by flipping the blanket and doing a combo roll and wriggle maneuver, managed to get under the blanket without dislodging the sheet from the mattress too much. Her body sank into the mattress almost all the way through. Feeling like the filling in a taco, she looked up to find Will laughing, then starting to unbutton his jeans. She should have tucked her head beneath the covers, but half an hour ago she'd been fantasizing about exactly this, and so she watched him as he undressed and found the taut belly and muscular thighs to be quite to her liking. And there was enough light for her to notice that a bulge was growing between those thighs. He was still laughing as he struggled between the covers. She held the blanket up for him, and when he was finally lying beside her, she couldn't help it. She ran her hand along his shoulder. He stiffened. The next instant, they were on each other.